Greetings, it's the Digital Dog, and in this video tutorial we're going to cover soft proofing in Adobe Photoshop. Let's start with a definition of what soft proofing is, and keep in mind what you're going to see applies to Adobe Lightroom as well. Soft proofing is an on-screen simulation of what the image will look like before it's converted to an output color space or even a different color space, but before you actually make that conversion. So what we can do is we can work in our RGB working space. For example, we'll be demoing an image that's in Adobe RGB 1998, but before I actually convert it to the output color space, I can simulate on screen what that image is going to look like in a particular color space before doing so. And I can also simulate on screen how the different rendering intents are going to appear before I actually make that decision. So let's talk about soft proofing. We're going to use Photoshop's customized proof setup, and all we have to do is load that dialog box and then select the ICC profile we want to use for simulating on screen what that image would look like if we were to convert that image into that profile. Now in this module I'm going to talk mostly about converting to an output color space for print. So we're going to be soft proofing our ICC output profiles for our printer, deciding which of the rendering intents we want to use. And what we're going to do is we're going to possibly edit the image a little bit. We're going to make output specific edits if necessary to make the image look a little bit better and more appropriate before we actually make our print. But we're going to edit in our RGB working space while we're viewing this simulation. So instead of converting to an output color space and then editing the image, we're going to edit in the full gamut of the working space that we have at our disposal while we view the simulation and make output specific edits. And I'll demo that coming up. Now these edits are only applied for a specific rendering intent going out to a specific printer. So every time you load a different ICC output profile and pick a different rendering intent, the simulation on screen is going to be slightly different. What we're going to do is we're going to make these output specific edits based on the output profile we're viewing, and we're going to do these edits on a layer, and we'll save that in our master file in a layer set, which I'll show you. That way we can go back and reprint that image anytime we wish, and those output specific edits are always there for us to use. And as you'll see, we can even drag and drop those output specific layer edits into different files going out to the same printer, so we don't have to make the edits over and over again. So what we want to do is go into the View menu and customize our proof setup. Let's take a look at that in Photoshop. So here I am in Adobe Photoshop, and all I have to do is simply go into the View menu, Proof Setup, Customize. I'll talk about these other items in the drop-down menu, but let's look at this first and foremost. So I'm simply going to select Custom, and this is our Proof Customize dialog box here. Now at the top, you'll notice that we can, like many other areas in Photoshop, configure this particular dialog box and then save these to disk and load them in the future. In fact, that's what you're seeing when I go into Proof Colors right here. I've made a set of 4 presets for this one particular printer using this one paper. I'll go into detail about that in a second. But let's go into our Proof Setup Customize. You now understand that I can build different presets here. That's all that's happening up here in this menu here. At this point, what I want to do is select what I want to simulate on screen. So for this example, we're going to pick an output profile for my 3880 on luster paper. And hopefully you can see on screen the soft proof kick in. I can turn this preview on and off like other dialog boxes. Again, I recommend you always have this on. But there's no soft proof, and that's the soft proof on. And you can see some dramatic differences here in the saturated greens and up in this area here of these saturated colors. Notice what happens when I toggle between relative colorimetric and perceptual. We see a difference on screen. As I've said in other videos, what's the right rendering intent to select? And the answer is the one that looks best on screen, and that's image specific. Now I will say that about 8 times out of 10, I usually prefer a relative colorimetric rendering intent visually on screen. But that doesn't mean I shouldn't toggle these different rendering intents and pick the one based on what looks best for this particular image. So when you pick these particular rendering intents, the soft proof kicks in and it shows you how it's going to control the remapping of out of gamut colors. And you simply pick the one you like the best. I should mention that you're probably never going to use what's called an absolute colorimetric rendering intent, either for soft proofing or for conversion. This is used for what's called proofing, when you want to make one printer simulate another printer. And what you'll notice is how more yellow on screen the image appears in absolute relative colorimetric versus relative colorimetric. These two rendering intents are identical. The only difference is how the white is going to be controlled during the conversion. And so if you notice, if I toggle between relative colorimetric and perceptual, the white doesn't look any different. Let me toggle it one more time. If you look at the paper white here, perceptual, saturation, relative colorimetric, the white point remains the same. But if I use an absolute colorimetric intent, what it's going to do is it's going to take the information in the profile about the white of the paper and it's going to update that in the conversion. And as you can see, the image gets much more yellow on screen compared to the other rendering intents. So unless you're doing proofing, you're trying to make one printer simulate another printer, you're never going to use the absolute colorimetric intent. You're instead going to use the relative colorimetric intent. And once again, these two rendering intents use the same table in an ICC profile. The only difference is how they control white. So let's say, for example, that we like the simulation here on screen using relative colorimetric intent. We could simply click OK. But there's one other thing that we need to look at that's very important in soft proofing. That's these on-display options called Simulate Paper Color and Simulate Black Ink. Right now, what's happening is we are getting a soft proof using the relative colorimetric intent. But the display is trying to pump out the brightest white it can on screen, and it's trying to make the darkest black on screen that it can. It's not taking the contrast ratio of the paper in mind when it makes this soft proof. So this is the blackest black the display can produce, and this is the whitest white the display can produce. And it's not using the profile to do that. If we turn on the Simulate Paper Color, you'll notice that both the paper color and the black ink check together, and the image looks much more muted. And that's because what's happening is the ICC profile understands the contrast ratio of this particular printing process. Now notice we can do just simulate black ink, and there's not much difference on screen. It looks a little bit less black in the blackest area. In fact, let me zoom in here and you'll see. I'll move this over. If I simulate the black ink on and off, hopefully you can see over the internet that it is a little bit less black on screen. It's a little bit more muted. But where we really see a big difference is when we use the Simulate Paper Color, and that always toggles on the Simulate Black Ink. So notice if I turn this on and off, there's a dramatic change on screen, and also both the simulation checkboxes go on at the same time. And this is a very important option. This is going to give you a much more accurate soft proof on screen to what the print is going to look like. Simply because, again, the blackest black of the print is being accounted for, and the whitest white of the print paper and its color is being accounted for. So if I turn this on and off, you can see that there's a big difference in the contrast ratio. So I'm going to select OK, and we'll move on. Okay, I'm going to zoom out. And one of the things I want you to notice is that up in the menu bar here, the title of the actual image, it gives me the name of the actual image, which is the 2014 printer test file, tells me the zoom ratio, tells me it's an RGB 16-bit, but also notice when the soft proof is on, it shows me the name of the soft proof here above in the title bar. So if I go into View, Custom, you'll notice that they match. You can toggle the soft proof on and off by using Command Y on the Mac or Control Y on Windows. So that's an easy way to toggle the soft proof on and off. You can see the image updates on screen, whether it's on or off, and you'll notice that when it's on, it gives me the name of the soft proof that's being currently used here on screen. So that's useful. So once again, on, off. One of the things that you need to be aware of is, in this case, the soft proof was set up with the paper white and black ink simulation on, and that's why it looks so muddy when we toggle on and off. One of the problems is that when you look at an image here, nice and bright and full contrast ratio and without the simulation, and then you instantly toggle the soft proof on using this Control or Command Y, you think to yourself, ooh, that looks really awful and ugly on screen. And it does, because you're watching it update. And you need to give your eyes to adapt to this new preview. Then it won't look so ugly. The reason I mentioned this key command is that one of the things that you might want to do is set up your proof setup, and then either close your eyes or look away when you have your hands on the keyboard for the key commands for turning the soft proof on. Turn your head away from the display, turn the soft proof on, wait a second or so, and then look at the image on screen. It doesn't really look ugly. You've given your eyes time to adjust to this new preview. And even though it looks uglier here than here, the fact of the matter is that if you want an accurate on-screen representation of what your print's going to look like, you absolutely need to have the soft proof on with the simulation checkboxes invoked. So this is how you open up the customized proof setup. You'll also notice we talked about the fact that you can have presets already set up for your soft proofing, and I'm going to show you that in a second. And we talked about how you can toggle a soft proof on and off using a key command. If you go into your proof setup, and you'll notice that it's called sticky, it remembers the last used setting. What you can do is you can save this and give it a name, and then in the future you can pick them here in this drop-down menu. Now what I recommend you do is make 2 sets per rendering intent. You'll notice that I have perceptual, and then I have one called perceptual simulate. I have rel call, or relative colorimetric, and relative colorimetric simulate. And all I've done was made 2 sets. I load my ICC profile for the printer that I want to soft proof. I select a rendering intent. I turned off the simulation and I hit save, and I gave it a name. I then turned on the simulation, hit save, and gave it a name. I toggled to perceptual and did the same. 1 off, 1 on. And now what I can do is I can simply toggle between these 4 options when I want to see the soft proof for this particular printer. So I can see perceptual on without the simulation, perceptual on with the simulation, relative colorimetric without the simulation, relative colorimetric with the simulation. And now I don't ever have to go back into this dialog box when I want to soft proof. I can simply come up to View, go into Proof Setup, and you'll notice that those 4 options are here for me to simulate on screen. Let's talk about these other options before we move on. In another video where I covered the Photoshop color settings, I showed you how you can set up a CMYK profile. So what happens is if you select soft proof working CMYK, what it's going to do is it's going to soft proof that particular CMYK profile, one that was loaded here. So for example, it's going to use, in this case, US Web Coded Swap V2. That's all that particular option does. And for whatever reason, if you wanted to come in here and just soft proof the cyan plate, or you wanted to come in here and see just the black plate, that's what that soft proof option is going to do for you. Not sure how useful that is, but the important thing is to understand that working here refers to the CMYK profile that you've set up in your color settings. We also have 3 options here, one called Legacy RGB for Macintosh, one called Internet Standard sRGB, and one called Monitor RGB. I'm not sure how useful these are, but let me show you what they do. If I select, for example, Internet Standard sRGB, the image is going to show me what this particular document would look like on the internet without color management. Now it looks pretty awful because the image is in Adobe RGB 1998. I haven't converted it to sRGB for the internet. So if I were to just put this image up on screen and look at it on the internet, on this monitor, on this system, it would look this way, which is pretty ugly. Legacy Monitor RGB is virtually the same as Internet Standard sRGB, except it's going to use the old Gamma 1.8 settings that the Macintosh used many, many years ago. And so when I select it, it still looks pretty ugly, but it looks brighter. And then lastly, if I come up here and I pick Monitor RGB, what this is going to do is it's going to show me what the image looks like using my display profile outside an ICC-aware application. It doesn't look bad, but it doesn't look accurate because it should really have no soft proofing on. In other words, it should look like this. So there's a slight difference if I toggle this on and off. Here's color managed Adobe RGB in Photoshop. Here's Adobe RGB on a wide gamut display just using my monitor profile, simulating no color management. And there's a slight difference on screen, especially if you look here in these saturated colors. I'm not really sure why you'd want to do this. Basically, what this is going to do is show you what these images would look like without color management in these three particular modes. And as we've seen, you always want to implement color management for the proper preview. Lastly, we have two settings here that try to simulate what two types of color blindness would look like. If you were colorblind, you can simulate on screen. Again, I'm not really sure how useful that is, but that's what they do. So let's turn off our soft proof by using our Control or Command Y key. And here we are back looking at this image in Adobe RGB 1998 color managed. Going back to our notes, talked about the customized proof settings and the save settings up above that you can toggle on and off after you create them. Also, once you save them to disk, you can load them on different machines. And the interesting thing is that the ICC profile is actually embedded in that saved file. So even if you move these save settings from machine A to machine B, and machine B doesn't have AR's 3880 luster profile, you'll still be able to do a customized proof setup because the file that you save here has the profile embedded. Talked about device to simulate. You want to pick the ICC profile that you want to see simulated on screen. You pick the rendering intent based on what looks best to you on screen. Once again, you could pick perceptual or even saturation, but you'll probably pick either perceptual or relative colorimetric, and based on how the image looks on screen, that's what you'll select. This will tell us later on when we convert the image for printing which we want to use, but that's another video. But the important thing here is that once you decide what rendering intent looks best on screen, you want to keep note of that because you'll be using that when you convert the file for a printer or when you go to print the file using Photoshop. And I talked about the display options, which controls the simulation of the paper and the ink on screen. The presets are a quick way to toggle different settings, talked about that. And I recommend that you name these presets with the name of the printer, the profile, and the rendering intent, and whether or not you had the simulate checkboxes on or off. Let's take a look at preserve RGB numbers. It's again a feature that may or may not be very useful. What it basically does is it shows you what this image would look like if you were to output the file without doing the conversion to the profile above in the drop-down menu called Device to Simulate. So for example, here we have an image in Adobe RGB 1998. I'm going to go into my proof setup, and I'm going to select a printer profile. So let's again pick our 3880 luster. And now if I select Preserve RGB Numbers, what Photoshop's going to simulate on screen is what it would look like if I were to send, in this case Adobe RGB 1998, to this printer, but I didn't use this profile. And as you can see, it looks really awful on screen. So if, for example, you were to make a print and not use color management to convert the file from Adobe RGB 1998 to this printer profile, and your print came out looking this ugly, you would probably be able to guess that you didn't convert the file from Adobe RGB 1998 to this particular printer profile. And that's all the Preserve RGB number does. So once again, the Simulate on Display checkboxes, the Simulate Paper Color and the Simulate Black Ink, what they do is they take the contrast ratio of the ink and paper into account. Now, what I'm going to recommend is that when you look at these soft proofs, you use what's called full screen mode. Here we are in Photoshop, and you'll notice that I have my UI set to be fairly dark, which is something we weren't able to do in earlier versions of Photoshop. Your eye adapts to the whitest white in the image. And what you'll notice is that we have a white, very white here. This is actually RGB 255, 255, 255 in this background. But you'll also notice up on here in the user interface of the menus and sometimes in the palettes, those are also going to be as white as the display can make them. So if you go into your proof setup and you turn on your simulate, you'll notice that this white is not as white as the white up here. And one of the problems is that when you view this image on screen, your eye is going to adapt to this bright white. Adobe can't control this particular white. That's part of the user interface of the operating system. So what I suggest you do is whenever you look at an image with the simulation on, you work in what's called full screen mode. If you type the F key twice, you'll notice that the menus disappear. And now our eye adapts to this white, the whitest white here on screen, not this white. And that makes it much easier when you're trying to evaluate if you've got a good screen to print match. You would look at the image this way in full screen mode with the simulation on. You would then move your head to your viewing booth, let your eyes adapt for a second, and view the print. And you'll notice that you'll get a much better screen to print match if your eye isn't being fooled by the whitest white of the user interface UI, but instead the whitest white that's being simulated at this time. When you want to look at the image on screen and view a print at the same time and evaluate if you have a really good match between the two, work in full screen mode. So, soft proofing with and without paper simulation. What you want to do is load the ICC profile, decide what rendering intent you want, and then turn the simulation on and off depending on what type of simulation you want. A lot of times if you're editing the image on screen, you're going to want the simulation on. If you're looking at the image and comparing it to the print, you're going to want the simulation on. But if you're trying to decide whether or not you want a particular rendering intent, it might be easier to pick with the simulation off at first and then turn it on. So, soft proofing with and without paper simulation. What you want to do is load the ICC profile, decide what rendering intent you want, and then turn the simulation on and off depending on what type of simulation you want. A lot of times if you're editing the image on screen, you're going to want the simulation on. If you're looking at the image and comparing it to the print, you're going to want the simulation on. But if you're trying to decide whether or not you want a particular rendering intent, it might be easier to pick with the simulation off at first and then turn it on. Now, before we move on and look at editing our images output specific for our soft proof, let's take a quick look at something called the Out of Gamut Overlay, which I don't find to be very useful at all, and I'll explain why. The Out of Gamut Overlay predates ICC profile soft proofing. It was around before Photoshop 5 introduced this new concept. And what it does is it puts an ugly overlay. You can control the color, but in this case you can see it's an ugly dark green. It places an overlay over colors that it thinks are out of gamut based on the profile that I've set up here. So I have my Epson 3880 luster profile loaded in customized soft proof, and if I go and select in the menu out of gamut colors, it produces this overlay. And one of the problems is it treats out of gamut colors all the same. If a color is just a tiny bit out of gamut, it produces this ugly solid overlay. If the color is greatly out of gamut, you get the same thing. And in the old days, before soft proofing, the idea was that you would edit the file, try to desaturate it so all this overlay disappeared, and therefore your image would then be in gamut for printing. So, as you can see here, I'm going to go into my proof setup. I have my Epson 3880 profile loaded here. And if I go view, gamut warning, I just get this really ugly overlay. It's showing me that all these colors are unprintable. And as I said, what you were supposed to do is go in with maybe the sponge tool set to desaturate or make some adjustment layers and make this disappear. It's not very useful. As I said, this out of gamut overlay predates ICC soft proofing, which gives you a much better simulation on screen by toggling the rendering intent and showing you how the image will appear on the print in a simulation. As I've mentioned in other videos, when we use different rendering intents, we can either clip or compress the colors. I would say just let the ICC profile do all of this gamut remapping. And those profiles are going to do a much faster and much more accurate job of treating these out of gamut colors. And again, that's why we toggle between our different rendering intents and view the image on screen. In terms of soft proofing and output specific edits, what we're going to do is we're going to duplicate our image so that we can see what it looks like before we do an edit, and then we're going to set the soft proof on the master image. We have to do this because there's no way of editing an image with the soft proof on and viewing it with the soft proof off at the same time. So let's take a quick look at what I'm talking about. So here's my master image in Adobe Photoshop. And I have my soft proof on. All I'm going to do is go under Image, Duplicate, and I'm just going to call this Preview. And you'll see I have a second image here. I'll make it the same size. And you'll notice when I make the duplicate, the soft proof is off. Soft proof is on over here. Soft proof is off over here. So now I can see the difference on screen between the image with the soft proof. And one of the things I notice right off the bat is that, well, of course, this image looks a little bit more muted because I'm looking at the contrast ratio of the print, but it looks cooler to me. The dog seems a little bit more yellow over here. He looks kind of bluish here, and that's because we have the paper simulation on, and our paper has a bluish tint to it. So what I want to do is I want to target this file because I want to edit this image while viewing this image. I want to make an output specific adjustment just to edit this image to look a little closer to this image over here. And I'm going to do that on a layer. So let me open up my layer palette. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go Layer, New Adjustment Layer. And I think the first thing I'll do is I'll go into Curves. And I'm going to call this Output to 3880 Warm Image. And all I'm going to do is come down here to my blue channel, and I'm going to make my highlights just a little bit warmer. So I'm viewing the image over here of the dog, and I'm just trying to make the highlights a little bit more yellow. It just seems a little cool to me. And if I turn the layer on and off, you can see it's a little bit closer to the image on the right. It's very subtle. You're never going to make this image and this image look exactly the same because we have a completely different color gamut here, and we're simulating the paper white and ink black going out to a printer. But as you can see in this one output specific edit, the image looks a little bit closer to the image on the right. It's just a little bit warmer. I've lost sort of that coolness in the white snow and on the dog. You're probably going to want to do most of these very subtle edits on adjustment layers. I find that curves and sometimes hue saturation can also be useful. Let's go back in here and make a new adjustment layer. Hue saturation. We could give it a name. We don't have to though. And perhaps in this case, what I want to do is I want to just adjust the saturation a tiny bit higher. Again, you're not going to be able to do too much because we are working with colors that are out of gamut. This is another case where you might want to come in here and use selective colors. So for example, we could go in here and say, let's make the yellows a little bit more yellow or less yellow to try to match this image over here. And now we have two adjustment layers. These are output specific simply to make this image look a little bit closer to this image over here. Now what I would do at this point is come up here and say new group from layers, and I would call this Epson 3880 luster, and we use rel call. Select OK. And then what we can do is we can put these adjustment layers directly into this layer group or folder of layers. And so now I can toggle them both on and off, and you can see the difference. The other thing I can do is if I wanted to use the same printer and edits on a different image, I can just drag and drop this onto the image itself, like over here. I don't have to recreate these adjustment layers. So now this particular image has this layer group in them. And you can see as I toggle them on and off, it makes a change. The idea here is that this is output specific adjustments for this particular printer and rendering intent with this particular profile. I may have to go and do some slight edits based on the image, but I don't have to reinvent the wheel. I can use these over and over again. And what I can do on my master image is I can turn this off, and I will only turn them on and use them if I want to make a print. So that's the idea of output specific edits. So to review, what we want to do is we want to duplicate the image so that we have a before and after preview. We want to set up our soft proof with our paper white and black ink simulation. We want to make sure that the two images are side by side at the same zoom ratio so that we can compare them. And then we're going to use some adjustment layers and try to make the master image that we're going to print look a little bit closer to the preview image that we built. The preview image is not going to be saved. It's only there for us to view on screen. As soon as we make our adjustment layers, we can just close it. We don't have to save it. And you have to keep in mind, you're never going to get a perfect match. The idea is simply to look at the two side by side and edit them if necessary to get them closer. Now, you don't have to do this for every image too. You may turn on the soft proof, you may turn on the simulation for the ink and paper and look at it on screen and say, that's great, I'm ready to print. But if you do see a difference on screen that you don't like, for example, the dog I felt was a little bit too cool and needed to be warmed up, you can then make these output specific edits if you desire. So to review, the image on the left is the master image, the one we want to print and edit. The image on the right is the preview. We're just using that as a guide, a visual guide, and here on screen you can see that the dog on the right seems a little bit warmer than the dog on the left. He just seems a little cool and I just don't like the way it looks as much. You'll notice too, other areas of the image are not as affected. So again, if we were just printing, say, those three women, we might not have any objection to the way it looks and might just print it as is. But as I said, in this case, I think the dog and the overall image is a little cool. The image on the left is cooler, the image on the right is what I want, so I'm going to make a slight edit, and all I did was build a adjustment layer and pull up the curves, go into my blue color channel, and do a very, very slight edit to warm up the dog just a little bit. I edit the image so that the image on the left and the image on the right are visually closer to what I want. And then I save them in a layer group, and I showed you how to do that. Name the layer group with the rendering intent, the name of the profile, and then you can use those edits over and over again. You don't have to reinvent the wheel every time. You can drag and drop them to different images and use them in the future. Talk about the Out of Gamut Overlay. It's based on the ICC profile that you pick in your proof setup, but it's not really useful. You select the proof setup from the custom menu. You select the ICC profile that you want to use in the device to simulate. You'll also notice that the rendering intent plays no role with the out of gamut colors. That's why I recommend soft proofing. For example, here's the image that I edited, and I have my soft proof on. I can toggle it off with my control key, but now it's on. If I go into the proof setup, you'll notice that I have it set to relative colorimetric. If I come up here and I say that I want to see my out of gamut colors, there's my ugly green overlay. If I go into my proof setup and toggle between relative colorimetric, perceptual, you see the background update behind this ugly green overlay, but the overlay itself doesn't change whatsoever. It only changes when I change the profile to something different. So let's pick a Noritzo, and you can see that in this case, the green updates. But the perceptual versus the relative colorimetric, no change on screen in terms of the overlay. So it's not at all useful in my opinion. Better just use the soft proofing, let the profile control the out of gamut colors, pick the profile rendering intent that you like visually on screen and move on.